Hello, everyone, and welcome to How to Build an Audio Brand via Podcasting. I'm Terran Benedict, and let's just get started. So, who am I? Well, I work at Anvil Media. I'm a social media specialist and account executive. I am also an avid podcast enthusiast. I have written several blog articles, and I've listed those out here as well for you. You might find useful. I really got into podcasting probably about 2 years ago. I've started my own podcast. I'm starting a couple more this summer. I've really just gone through the pains and struggles myself along the way. I've done a lot of research. I've made a lot of connections and learned firsthand, what it takes to start a podcast, as well as, the marketing side of it all. So why podcasting, you might be asking? Well, podcast listeners, they're very hyper engaged, and studies have shown that they listen to the sponsored ads in podcasts, and they actually follow up, and they're very high in conversion rates as well. 80% of podcast listeners, they listen to all or most of each episode that they listen to. They consume an average of 7 shows per week. That's anywhere between 3.5 to 7 hours, depending on the length of those podcast episodes. And they're consuming those every single week. In 2018, 44% of the U.S. population listened to a podcast, and almost 30% of the podcast listens monthly. This number continues to grow. And when you think about 30% of the population listening monthly, out of the 44% that's listened, that's a huge, huge chunk of people who have listened that continue to listen. And 50% of homes are podcast fans. They have podcast fans in them. So that's over 60 million homes that your brand can reach monthly. So that's why you should be podcasting. So if you're considering starting a podcast for your brand, some questions you should ask yourself, does your audience listen to podcasts? Do you have valuable information to share? Now, like I said, almost 30% of the U.S. population is listening to podcasts. So, there is a huge likelihood that a portion of your audience is listening to podcasts monthly, possibly even weekly. So does your brand care enough about itself to talk about products and services or industry-related news on a regular basis? Because you do need to do it on a regular basis. You need to fill a show. Whether that's 30 minutes or an hour, you need to fill that time every week or every other week or monthly. However, whatever the cadence you put on your podcast, you need to do that consistently. Are you looking to build a relationship between your brand and your audience? Do you want your brand to have a voice? And this podcast can act as that voice. We talk about your brand voice on social media all the time, and a podcast really actually puts a legitimate voice to your brand. So that's something huge to consider if you're considering starting a podcast. Do you want to take the time to learn the technical details of podcasting? And if not, are you willing to pay someone to handle the technical details for you? As somebody who has had to live through the struggles of the learning curve that goes along with all the technical details of this, I can say that if you can afford it, get somebody who knows what they're doing, because you're going to have to learn a lot. And if you have somebody who already knows what they're doing, less mistakes are going to be made, less headaches are going to be had. So why are people listening to podcasts? Well, if we look at podcasts and the people who are listening, they'll describe these podcasts as more authentic, because these are real people. Whether they're celebrities or just an average Joe or an average Jane, these are real people hosting these podcasts. And whereas YouTube vloggers, used to be seen this way as authentic, they're now just seen as gimmicky and attention hungry. So podcasts really have these experts that are gaining followers based on their expertise, not just some, wacky thumbnail they choose, or based on their looks, or the fact that they're jumping on social trends. So moreover, it's a great source of inspiration for people, staying educated on topics that interest you, or even just, increasing your interest level during mundane tasks. So let's get into understanding podcasters, because if we're going to work with them, or if we're going to be them, we need to understand them. So why are people starting these podcasts? Well, the short and simple of it is because they have stories to tell. These are natural storytellers. They have information they want to share. They want to become thought leaders on certain topics. They want to start an online community. They want to connect with like-minded people. But overall, the main thing is that they just want to share knowledge and experience. These people, they want to talk. They probably talk too much, just like I'm doing right now probably. So let's get on to the next slide. The average cost of the equipment, this is huge, because this really helps you understand the mindset of these podcast people. They're putting their own money into buying this equipment, so they are committed to what they're doing, and they're going to work hard to make sure it's successful, because they're investing in themselves. They're betting on themselves. Some of the things they have to buy, they have to pay for hosting fees, whether that's through a website that they pay annually, or third-party hosting sites, which are typically paid monthly, but you can sign up for annual fees for that as well. You have equipment costs. You need to pay for the microphone. You need to pay for sound mixers. You need to pay for adapters and all the cords and all the, everything that goes along with it. You need to pay for editing software. And of course, they're also paying with their time and effort. So this can cost anywhere between $75 to $500 just to get started. And then they're paying monthly costs that could range from anywhere as little as $20 a month to $100 a month. So these people really do understand what they're getting themselves into, and they're fully into it. So if your brand voice matches their voice on their podcast, then that they're going to work hard for you, and they're going to present your content to their audience in the most engaging ways, because that's what they do. So how do brands and podcasts work together? Well, we've kind of already touched on this, but just to reiterate, why do podcasts need sponsorship? Because they're paying a lot of money, and it costs money to improve the production value of podcasts over time. So all podcasters, they dream of podcasting for a living. They want that to be their full-time job. So, and there are podcasters who do earn enough money that they can just do that and dedicate 100% of their professional time to their show, and it just makes it that much better. And podcasters do work a lot. There are some podcast hosts out there that work 80 hours a week, and that's their full-time job, and they love it, and they work hard, and they never stop. So the goal of a sponsor should really be to position themselves to the audience as a savior in some form or fashion, because essentially you are keeping the show, broadcasting, you're improving the production value, or at least keeping it high, and you're making sure that that content is rolling out consistently. And of course, the sponsor should be seen as a savior to the host of the podcast themselves, because helping them turn their hobby into a full-time job, that's their dream. So is podcast sponsoring right for your brand? Well, here's some more questions to ask yourself. Does your audience listen to podcasts? Are there podcasts out there that align with your brand? The answer is yes, because there are so many different types of podcasts out there. Just look around. You're going to find a podcast that fits your key demographic, and the values that your brand holds dear. Can your brand offer value to a sponsored ad, in a sponsored ad on a podcast in some form of a discount or free shipping? If you can give value to these listeners, they're going to want to pay attention, and that's the point. Does your brand want to build a relationship with its audience? This is a way where you can build a relationship through that podcast itself. You're a part of this entertainment that they frequent, that they check in on weekly or monthly. You're a part of that. And do you want your brand voice to share with that podcast? So essentially, you have to see it like this. If you have your own podcast, that's the voice for your brand. But if you're sponsoring on a podcast, you're essentially making that podcast, to that audience at least, your voice. That's your brand voice. So you have to really consider that when you're choosing what podcast to sponsor, because you're making this podcast the voice for your brand. So that's a huge step. Do you want to reap the benefits of podcasting without actually having to produce a weekly show yourself? If all of these answers are yes, then I think you're right for sponsoring. But before we get into the best practices for sponsoring, let's get into how to actually start and maintain your own podcast so that you know where your money is going. So how to create your own podcast? Well, there's a lot of things that go into it, but first you have to define your purpose and goals. What is the goal of this podcast? Are you just trying to increase brand awareness? Is this for educational purposes? Do you want to support or empower the community or certain movements for your podcast? And then the structure of your podcast has to support those goals. The content has to focus on your purpose at all times. So what are the goals for your podcast? Are you just trying to break into new audiences? Are you trying to increase the size and value of your online network? You're trying to increase the traffic to your website or create more personal relationships with your customer base? These are definitely big things that you have to decide on these before you can move forward onto the next part, which is selecting a host. So you need to select someone to be the voice of your brand. I've already talked about this. This is a huge portion of this. You need to select the host. You need to decide if they're going to do this podcast solo or if they're going to have a co-host on it. If you have a co-host, then possibly you want them to build momentum off of each other and keep a conversation lively. You have to make sure that they have good chemistry in order for this to be possible. You have to decide, do you want this host to be an interviewer? Do you want them to interview partners or industry leaders that come onto your show? And this person needs to be a good speaker. They need to enunciate everything and keep their voice level without sounding too monotone. The better the speaker, the more attentive the audience will be. So you want somebody who's a good public speaker, plain and simple. Even though they're not going to actually be out in public, they need to be able to keep a conversation going. They need to not stick to the ums and uhs, which I know I'm guilty of that. I just did it. So this person should know your brand well. This is huge. Whether or not they're actually going to be the one who's supposed to be the expert, they do need to know your brand and your services or products to a certain degree. They can be a novice on your brand, or they can be the expert. If they're not the person who's answering the questions, they need to be the person who's at least knowing what questions to ask. So planning content. What type of content do you want your podcast to have? Well, you need to make sure that you have proper supports in place. You need to amplify, you need to maximize the value of the content that you're providing. Are you going to have guests on this podcast? Well, if that's the case, you need to make sure that you have episodes completely laid out and scheduled well in advance to interview them. And you need to also have backup plans. What if they end up committing to an interview a month from now, and 2 weeks before they tell you, you know what, I can't make it. I can't hop on the phone. I can't do anything. I'm busy that day. Well, you need to have a plan B and preferably a plan C as well. Do you want to have co-hosts on this show? Do you want it to be more of a conversation, or do you want it to be more of an interview setting? You really need to plan these things out before you even pick up a microphone. And next, you need to decide on the show description. I say description before title because you need to write out exactly what your show is going to be about. And you need to use rich keyword descriptions. You want to make sure that it's a paragraph that really runs down exactly what your show is going to be about, so that people who look at it will know exactly what to expect, and when they decide to listen to an episode, they're not caught off guard. After you've done that, then you come up with your show title. And take your time on this, because you really don't want to just pick anything. You want to pick something that's brandable and something that's keyword rich, because iTunes really is a big search engine. It's the most popular place people are listening to podcasts. So if they're searching up something about, I don't know, street art, they're not going to be looking up your podcast. They're not going to discover your podcast if your title doesn't say something along those lines or include those keywords. You know, if you decide to name your podcast, let's say Painter's Alley, you're not going to be discovered for your street art because nobody's searching that up. So these are things to consider. You need to make sure that you can be discoverable through your title. And next, you need to outline your episode. So this is easy. You know, you've already decided what your show is going to be. You've decided your goals. So now you just need to create an introduction that's consistent. You need to give an overview, let's say, of your episode, and you can play with your outlines of your episodes. None of them have to be standard or exactly the same, but you should cover what topics you want in your outline, and you should cover your closing thoughts and your sign-off. Your sign-off should include, you know, where people can find you on social media, or have some sort of call to action for people. And then you'll want to test 2 to 3 episodes before launching anything. Your podcast needs to be as well done as possible before you start broadcasting it everywhere. It's not going to be perfect right out of the gate, but you know, you need to make sure that you're not putting something out there that you're going to absolutely hate or want to take down a couple weeks or a month from now. So test out episodes before launching. 2 to 3 is a good number to hit. A logo. So you're going to want to decide on a logo, and you want to make sure that it's brandable. You need something that's going to stick in people's minds. For iTunes, you're going to want to make your logo 1400 by 1400 pixels, and that's going to be true for any Podcatcher, which is a place where people listen to podcasts, such as iTunes and Spotify and whatnot. You'll want to make sure that your logo will actually tell a story about what your podcast is going to be about. If they can see your logo and they expect that it's going to be creative and upbeat, then they're going to enjoy hearing a creative and upbeat podcast. If it doesn't match the podcast tone itself, then it's not a good logo. You need to make sure that visually you're prepping people for your podcast as well. Next, you need to schedule. Planning your episodes a month in advance. I may even say plan 2 months in advance if you can. And if you can stockpile episodes to plan for when your speakers are taking vacation time, then that's great too. Additionally, you might You might even just want to have an episode in your pocket, in the back of your pocket every week, especially if you're doing interview episodes, because if those fall through, then you need something to just be able to put out there that's going to be quality content, that's not going to be something you had to rush last minute. And then when we get into the equipment portion of this, I'm going to cover 3 different price points for equipment setups. So the first one is the cost-effective setup, or as I like to call it, the dirt cheap setup. This podcast is not going to break the bank, but it is going to give you good sounding audio at a good price. So first, you want to take a cardboard box. You can see in this picture right here, she has one of those like organization square baskets you can find at Target or something, and she then takes cheap foam squares and she lines the inside of that box and puts her microphone inside of there. This will help deter all of that background excess noise. And then you want to make sure you get a condenser microphone, and you can actually find a good one for about $20 to $30 on Amazon, one of the newer brand microphones. And you want to buy, just really any cheap microphone stand will be fine. And then make sure you have the proper cords to plug into your laptop and whatnot. And then you can download a free version of Audacity for your recording and editing purposes. So this will reduce the echo and white noise that you'll get through your recordings, and it'll improve the sound quality, and you're going to sound fine. The limitations of this, though, are that it will get awkward if you have somebody in the studio that you're interviewing and you're both talking into boxes. It just feels a little off. So next, we have the average setup. This is the semi-pro setup. What you do is you get a higher quality condenser microphone around $50 or $70. Get a good sound mixer. This has multiple audio ports for different microphones. You get the microphone stand, and this time instead of putting a square box in front of you, you take cardboard, you take spray adhesive, and then you put foam squares on top of that, and now you've created your own noise absorbing panels to hang on the walls. No need to buy these $150 panels. You can make your own for about 25 bucks. Make sure that you have the proper cords to plug into your laptop and everything like that. Pay about $20 a month for Adobe Audition. This will be your recording and editing software. This is where you get a little bit increased post-production value. So this is going to be good for giving you the abilities to customize and control your audio, your sound effects, music, and it just it'll sound better, and it'll be a more open and welcoming recording space for if you have guests on the show. And now, if you're trying to get real fancy, this is the high-end setup. This is where your microphone is definitely going to cost you over $100. You could buy something that's a $250 Yeti microphone. Again, you're going to want to make sure that you have a sound mixer. You're going to want to have those foam panels. You're going to want to have Adobe Audition for audio, recording, and editing. This is definitely something where you would want someone who knows what they're doing, handling all of your equipment, and you would have a legitimate studio dedicated just for recording purposes. And then what about editing? I mentioned editing, but how do you edit a podcast? So the 2 programs I mentioned, one is free and one costs $20 a month. So Audacity is free. It's an open source program. It's been around forever. It keeps coming out with updates. There's so many forums and tutorials online about how to use it and how to troubleshoot things. But it does have its limitations. So Adobe Creative Cloud has Adobe Audition, which is a much more advanced editing software, and it has presets built in so that you really just have to drag and drop stacks of effects, and it cleans up your audio for you, and it just makes the whole editing process go by much quicker and with less headaches. So now, podcast hosting and broadcasting. Well, what's the difference? So a hosting site and a podcatcher, such as iTunes, are very different. You don't upload directly to iTunes. You upload directly to a hosting site for distribution. So if you're not using your website, you might use something like Buzzsprout. This is something you pay monthly, and you have a data allowance, and you upload audio files, which are then distributed to different podcatchers such as iTunes, Stitcher Radio, Spotify, and whatnot. This is where you perform all your optimizations to your channels. So you have all those show titles, episode titles, descriptions, all of that's up to date. And then you send your RSS feed to all these podcatchers, and that's where people actually view and download your episodes. So the best hosting options we have out there are really Libsyn Radio, Blueberry, SoundCloud, Buzzsprout, and Podbean. These are really good choices, and it really depends on what your monthly budget would be for this. These are all different data allowances, price points. So for instance, with Libsyn, at $5 a month, you're able to upload about 2 hours a month of audio. If that's really all you're going to be uploading, then that's a cheap $5 a month hosting fee that you can pay. And as for the best podcatchers out there, when it comes to iOS users, it's iTunes. Let's just be honest. If it's Android users, they might listen on a few different podcatchers such as Stitcher Radio, Podcast Addict, Dogcatcher Podcast Player, things like that. These four right here that I have images of, iTunes, Stitcher Radio, Google Play, and Spotify, are probably the top ones that you should be on. Next, you want to go to how to archive podcasts for free. How do we archive podcasts, and why are we doing this? Well, you have limited hosting data on these sites. So if you reach that max data and they won't allow you to upload any new episodes unless you remove other episodes, then you're losing those episodes forever, and that's not something you want. That's content. That's SEO that you're missing out on right there. So what you want to do is you want to go to YouTube, and you want to repurpose these audio files into video files and upload them onto YouTube, because YouTube has an SEO ranking of 100 in Google search, meaning that if your content on YouTube is optimized, it's very likely to show up in relevant search queries. So what you do is you don't need to actually film your podcast sessions, behind the scenes stuff. Although this is a popular tactic that a lot of people use, and they do get a lot of engagement from this, so it is an option, but it does take more production value. What you really need to do, this is all you need to do, is you need to select a thumbnail image and set that as the visual for the video, and then just underlay your audio track. That's it. Optimize that video, include links back to your podcatchers, such as on iTunes and Stitcher and everything else, your website, your products, anything. Put it all in there, and you're good to go. So now advertising your podcast. So this is still from the podcaster's perspective. When you're hosting your own podcast, you want to be on social media. You're going to want to go to Facebook and Twitter and just share those links to those episodes directly. Most likely your iTunes links are going to be the ones you share. On Instagram, you want to share a preview or an announcement of the latest episode. You're going to want to share behind the scenes pictures and videos, definitely in your stories and possibly in your posts as well. This just gives you more engaging content to share with your audience. And Instagram and Twitter are very good places for people to discover your podcast. On YouTube, we just mentioned it, you're going to want to repurpose those videos, but you're also going to want to create a playlist for them and date them by year or topic, whichever one you find is more helpful for you from an organization standpoint. And then on Pinterest, you're going to want to share those videos of the podcast, include some call to actions to tell people to subscribe to you on iTunes. And then on Google+, share the podcast episodes directly, same as Facebook and Twitter. On LinkedIn, especially if you're a professional podcast, you're going to want to share your blog. And if ideally you want to take an episode and write a blog post around that episode and then share that on LinkedIn. Include a call to action to tell people if they want more information about something to listen to your episode. You're going to want to share just related topics as well, and tell people that if they want to know more of your thoughts on this topic, to check out your podcast. And to boost the visibility, we can't forget about hashtags in regards to Instagram and Twitter. So you're going to want to look up and use some popular hashtags. Some popular ones for podcasts are literally just podcast, podcasting, and podcast guest. Those are popular hashtags to use for those. They're searched up often. They have a lot of engagement. Obviously, you're going to want to add in a branded hashtag for you for your podcast, and then you're going to want to add in any other hashtags that relate back to the content within that episode. And then finally, for social media, you're going to want to boost some posts as well. Put like $10 behind an episode just to increase the impressions and listens on that particular episode. You're going to want to set up Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, or LinkedIn ads, which can specifically target your audience. And then you're going to want to host your podcast. If you can host it on your website, then that's a great way for you to set up some pay-per-click conversions, pay-per-conversions instead of pay-per-click. You can set up a pixel on your site, and you can track when a person has actually listened to your podcast. And then when it comes to other ways to promote your podcast, cross-promotion is a great idea. Teaming up with another podcast that overlaps in terms of your audience. What you can do here is you can actually check out this other podcast. You can see that this is the type of audience that listens to their podcast. This is the type of value I can bring that audience. And once you've figured out what your mutual benefits are for both your podcast and this other podcast, you can reach out and present that partnership opportunity. Some things to keep in mind for this, though, are to make sure that you get analytics from this other podcast. You need to know what their listeners, how they interact with this podcast, and you also need to be ready to share your own analytics as well. You need to determine if this other podcast, what they can actually provide you in return. So are you looking to break into a new market? Do you see this partnership leading to that? You need to also be able to track your progress and results with this partnership. So this is where coupon codes come in, and link tracking and what have you. And finally, how to sponsor a podcast. So you don't want to start your own podcast. You want to sponsor one. So here's how you do it. You go to Midroll. Midroll is a third-party advertising company. They match advertisers with podcasters. So their goal is to let the podcasters, these content creators, focus on their shows, and then give advertisers the benefit of working with a professional sales team. I can speak from experience, having worked with influencers, social media influencers before for 3 years. A week-long discussion with a salesperson will take at least a month if you're talking directly to the content creator. A salesperson will actually understand what's going into a contract, what's happening, A content creator themselves, they just don't understand how things work. They often will ask for too much. They won't pay attention to deals within the contract. It can be a whole mess. So working with a third-party company like Midroll, it ensures that you're getting quality advertisement and that you have control over what's actually happening. One thing to mention about this is that Midroll uses a cost per thousand download model. So this is called a CPM, and a CPM of $25, for example, for a spot on a show with 10,000 downloads per episode will cost you $250. So that's 10,000 people who are downloading this episode or downloading episodes every single time one is released. So $250 to reach 10,000 people. And then with $25 CPM for 100,000 downloads, that would be obviously $2,500. So some best practices to keep in mind. First off, you got to make your host your advocate. You know, if you have a product or service, it's important to let that host actually try it out for free, just so they can get that real experience. Because when someone's speaking from experience about something, you can tell they're actually remembering things, and you can feel the authenticity in their voice when they're talking about it. So, you know, just keep in mind, anyone can read off of a piece of paper, but if you have sponsored ad spots from people who have that real experience, then they can possibly ad-lib a little bit with guidelines, of course. And someone who understands your brand will just end up making it so much better in the end. So the next one is just have great ad copy. You know, you don't just want to pitch a 150-word ad. In the end, you really just want to tell a story. So the great ad copy that you provide the podcast host will just make it so much easier for them to sell and to help your brand. And if you can give your podcast hosts, which I very much recommend this, give your podcast hosts some creative space to work within your ads. If you can give them guidelines for ad-libbing, then they can end up making your ad spot a part of the show instead of just a break from the show to talk about our sponsor. And then oftentimes with this example right here, some podcasts will have two hosts that will riff off of each other about a certain ad. You know, they'll share their personal experiences with the product, and they'll personalize your ad for you. And this becomes a part of the show that listeners don't want to miss out on. Next, you want to make sure you track everything. You want to offer coupon codes. You want to use these custom trackable URLs. And I would also recommend that you create a checkout survey. If you're selling products online, you want to have this checkout survey in tandem to verify where your customers heard of you and where they came from. And then lastly, you want to test and evaluate. Be sure to track and compare different ad spots to see what works better. And because giving up, you know, before you give up on any ad spot on a podcast that shares a key demographic with you, just try tweaking your ad copy a little bit and test again. And you're also going to want to listen to how the host is actually reading your ad, because this is very important. You may realize that the host is, you know, being too stiff about the ad spot, and they're not actually making it personal. You might want to have a conversation with this host about their experience with your product. Are they not really testing out your product or service, and why not? This might just give you good feedback for improving ad copy next time, as well as choosing a podcast host. So here's a good example of a sponsorship. So NatureBox found the podcast called If I Were You. Now NatureBox is a snack subscription service that tests well with busy millennials that don't necessarily have time to prep their own snacks. If I Were You is a comedic advice podcast that many millennials tune into to hear two unqualified jokesters give somewhat helpful advice, but always humorous advice. So NatureBox, what they do for their ads for these guys is they send them details of this special offer. You know, if it's 50% off, whatever. They give a tagline and a coupon code. The two hosts will then share those details, make some jokes, talk about the snacks they're currently getting in their subscription boxes, and then share the code and details again. The ad just becomes a part of the show. They can make more jokes, they can ad-lib, improvise, and the listeners just don't want to miss out on this because this truly is a piece of the entertainment value that they started listening for. So to get into a couple case studies, you know, the ROI from other businesses, Midroll actually offers some case studies on their website showing their great ROI for different businesses that work through them. So with Igloo Software, it's a company with a digital workplace platform, and they actually saw way back in 2013, before podcasts were really picking up speed, they saw 7% of their software opportunities coming directly from podcasts. But the big thing is that 21% of the opportunity value, all these leads, they were making the decision to purchase based on the podcast ads that they listened to. So almost a quarter of these leads that were coming in, this pipeline value, they made their decision to buy based on the podcast ads. Next, we look at Foot Cardigan. They claim that between 15 and 20% of all their sales opportunities are coming directly from podcast ads. Another great case study is Talenti. They surveyed 608 gastropod and spilled milk listeners, podcasts that they advertise on, and they found that 71% of them said that they were much more likely to buy Talenti after hearing the ad. And 74% of those listeners were able to recall which of the 25 gelato flavors were featured in the ad that they heard. So they are memorable ads. So, are you ready to get started in podcasting? Please let me know if you have any questions. Thank you. And this presentation will be given out to all of you. These slides will be sent to you after we're done here. Please utilize the chat if you have any questions for me, and I will answer those now. Okay, so I have a question here. Are certain genres of podcasts better to advertise on than others? So yes, I would actually say that given research, the best podcasts to advertise on are actually comedic podcasts, because when people are happy, they're more likely to buy. That's just plain and simple. That's really what studies have shown. So when you have people who are making light of the ad, but not actually making fun of the products and everything, that's where the guidelines come in. That's where people are happier, and they're more open to making purchases. One more question I have here is, do sponsored ads for B2B products work on podcasts? Yes, they do. That first case study I showed a couple slides back, Igloo Software, they are a B2B product, and they saw almost a quarter of their pipeline value coming directly from those podcast ads. So it is a great opportunity, even if you're a B2B product or service, because people are listening to these podcasts and people work at these other businesses. And if they've heard of you and they like you and they feel like they know your brand voice and values already through this podcast, they're more likely to follow through and convert. There is one more question I have here. I'll answer this one and then we'll wrap it up. How does one make a living being a podcaster? Do you have specific resources you could offer about how to do this? So yes, you can contact us and we can get involved in giving you a breakdown of all of that. How does someone make a living being a podcaster? Well, it's really from sponsorship opportunities. What happens is that when people sponsor your podcast, they not only cover the cost of the podcast, but they're paying for your time as well. So if you get multiple people, sponsoring your podcast, multiple brands sponsoring your podcast, what happens is that you're starting to make money there. And if you have enough people who are actually listening to your podcast and downloading, just as I mentioned earlier about the CPM that Midroll has, if it's $25 CPM for all of those downloads for 100,000 people, then you're making or you're getting paid, that sponsor is paying $2,500 for that ad. So you're getting a big percentage of that, being that it's your podcast. Midroll also takes a percentage. So that's how you end up making a living as a podcaster. All right, great. Well, thank you all for joining me and listening to me talk and talk. These slides will be sent out to you right after this presentation. I almost did it again. Take care, everybody. Thank you.